com és que s'hagi dedicat a una cosa tan poc natural? Vull dir, com explicaria el naixement i el desenvolupament de la seva feina d'escriptor?
I can probably identify 2 or 3 elements of it, and the ones beyond those 2 or 3 I don't want to identify in case, well, I'll give you a parallel case. The great British comedian John Cleese, who was part of the Monty Python team, possibly the greatest example of Englishness to emerge in the last 50 years, the most typical example of Englishness. John Cleese decided one day that he needed to find out why he was funny and why he needed to be funny. And he went to a psychoanalyst, and after a while the psychoanalyst and he agreed that it was because blah, 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 childhood, blah, 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 sex, blah, 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 impressing people, blah, blah, blah. When he understood it, he decided he no longer wanted to be funny. So for many years he stopped being funny. Disaster. So I don't want to know the hidden psychological, psychosexual, or whatever reasons why I want to write novels. I know that one of the, I think quite a strong element at the beginning was that I found it very difficult to address more than one person at a time. I was very shy and self-conscious as an adolescent and as a young man, and the idea of addressing, you know, a table of people at dinner made me feel, well, I just froze. And somehow writing a sentence on a piece of paper, and then, for example, if it was a book review, and you send it to a newspaper and they print it, and lots of people hear you. So it's a way of talking to people without blushing. And that was one of the elements. I mean, another of the elements, more serious, was that reading when I was, I don't know, 13 or 14, and I started reading real serious fiction for the first time, the great Russians, the French, the English novelists. I thought, they are describing what real life is, and nobody else is doing that. My parents are not telling me the truth. The newspapers are not telling me the truth. My schoolmasters are not telling me the truth. The priest is not telling me the truth. The politicians are not telling me the truth. And that was something I instinctively felt and knew at the age of 13 or 14. But of course, at that point, I always thought that other people were writers. Just as when I was 6 or 7, I would love to be an engine driver, but other people were engine drivers. That was very glamorous to me.
Si em permet, potser per això es diu a vegades que un escriptor ajuda a ensenyar-te coses que sabies, però que no sabies que sabies. No? És a dir, fins a quin punt això seria una bona definició del seu ofici. La veu, la seva feina en aquests termes? És a dir, vostè escriu amb aquest esperit, diguem-ne, de servei de cara als lectors, d'explicar-los coses que sabien, però que no sabien que sabien?
I only think in those terms on occasions like this. When I am being a public writer. And I do certainly agree with you that one of the aspects of writing is critical. That's to say, corrective. So saying, life is not like that, it's like this. And I think that runs through all my work and through most writers' work. You know, even when I wrote a little book about cooking called The Pedant in the Kitchen, which was a series of articles I wrote for the Guardian newspaper and then turned into a book. It was a way of saying, you open a cookbook, it's got these wonderful colored pictures, it's actually a work of pornography. It's as true to real cooking that I do as pornography is to real sex, you know? And so what you're doing is you're writing a corrective to the way that cookery writers describe it, you know. you're saying, actually, this makes you very anxious, this doesn't work, this makes you want to kill the cookery writer. And the result is a little disappointing always if you think it's going to be like that picture in the cookbook. So, you know, I can identify that locus and that function of the writer very clearly in that sort of work. But it obviously runs through everything that you write. But at the same time, when I'm at my typewriter, when I'm not being a public writer, but I'm being a private writer in front of my IBM 196C, I don't think. I think about the reader, the potential reader, in a completely different way, and I don't think I'm telling you something that you really know but have never expressed to yourself. I don't think you think that sex is like this, but it's really like this. You know, that was no way to write a book. You're thinking about that sentence is no good. This motivation needs working on. This character, but you called him by a completely different name in the last chapter. What's the weather like? You know, and things like that. You are at a very micro level most of the time, solving particular problems. And yes, this is one of the troubles, that sometimes fiction is taken to be fact and further taken to be autobiography. I very occasionally use my own life in my fiction, but it's always with a certain amount of trepidation, not because I'm afraid of confessing to certain things, though I am, because I'm not really a confessional sort of person, but because if you use something from your own life, or if you use the nature or the character of a friend, you can't. It's much harder to make it malleable. It's much harder to shift it. It comes ready-made. And so this sort of incident that happened to you on a train, which you think you can put into fiction, you often can't, because it's harder than if you had made up an incident on a train, because when it comes ready-made, you can't shift it. The character, you want that character to be different. You want it to be on a different train, and and even making the smallest change is hard work. So in a way, it's harder using your own life. It's harder doing that than imagining things. That's certainly what I found over the years. I mean, when I knew absolutely nothing about fiction and wrote my first novel, I started off writing it fairly close to my life, the first third of it, and then I began to imagine and make things up, and then it began to flow. So I think I learnt that fairly early on, and also my own life has been very, in terms of adventures and excitement, has been extremely boring. And so I wouldn't be able to get very much out of it if I didn't have an imagination. Do I think that that there are times when my imagination won't go far enough? Yes, I do. And when you get there, there's nothing you can do, except, all writers write to their strengths and try and hide their weaknesses or cover over them or grow them a little bit stronger. I was once, my first novel, which is called Metroland, I was originally going to call it No Weather, W-E-A-T-H-E-R, because I hated weather in books. Whenever you came across weather in books, it was always sort of nudging you, It's a fine day, it's a stormy day, there's a thunderstorm coming, there's some lightning, You know, it's never just ordinary bloody weather. It's just, it always means something, the weather, in novels, in the 19th century novels that you used to read. And I thought, I'm going to write a novel with no weather in it. And I don't know, I think there's no weather in Metroland, but I haven't gone through and checked. There might be very little rain at some point. But I sort of, you know, this is the sort of where you get to the limits of, and it's not just the limits of your imagination, it's also the limits of your sort of obstinacy or your refusal to be interested in something. I mean, I'm interested in the weather to a certain extent, whether I need an umbrella, things like that. But I don't want to make it symbolic. I really, really don't. It's not just le mot juste, it's la phrase juste, it's the sentence, it's the paragraph, it's the rhythm, it's the avoidance of repetition. I don't think that Flaubert probably thought any more than I do or most writers do that the world and language match exactly. I think that's a complete illusion. I think there are many things in the world that don't match. It's like translation. It's like, you know, one language doesn't match another, and the world out there doesn't match the world of language. It's a very approximate. So it was not so much. I don't think none of us think that there is le mot juste there, but there is a roughly true approximation in the form of a sentence, perhaps. Of course, all writing goes through various stages, and the first draft, which I always do fairly loosely and fairly quickly, is exhilarating. You think you're flying. You think this is coming out wonderfully. Of course it isn't, but you have to believe that in order to do it. And then comes the real work of writing, which is rewriting. And it's as much to make it as true as possible as it is to make the sentence as beautiful as possible. Flaubert said that prose is like hair. It shines with combing. But you can comb too much, and then the hair falls out, you know, we all know. Or you can comb too hard. You have to comb just so. Do you develop a social conscience through writing fiction? No, probably not. In one sense, being any sort of artist, in one sense, being any sort of artist narrows you and concentrates you and makes you more egotistical in order to produce what it is that you produce. And when you've produced that, you're then allowed to be a normal human being on the side afterwards. In terms of the interplay between art and society, it tends to depend more on the society and the state of that society than on the art. That's to say, the freer the society, the more everything can be said. In some ways, the less social impact art can make. The more narrow, the more oppressive, the more exciting the art can become. I am and always have been suspicious of the idea that literature is put to the service of something greater, which is politics or social advancement. And I think that as much as anything, it comes down to temperament, to something which is formed before you even become a writer. I mean, I think Orwell was formed very strongly by his experiences as a young child, being sent to a beastly preparatory school when he was 7 or 8 or whatever age you get sent to them in England. Thank God I was never sent to one. and that he really believed that his job, he was put on earth to change things, and that words were his best tool to change things. I have never thought I was put on earth to change things. I think as far as I was put on earth as a writer, I was put on earth to ask questions, to say, what do you think about this? What would happen if things were like this rather than like that? I've never wanted to tell people how to live or how they ought to live, or suggest that a better way could be done if this or that were changed. And I think that is something that is fundamental and is below and before the point at which you achieve consciousness and self-consciousness as a writer. It's also true that death is one of those things that is very particular. E.M. Forster, a novelist who I always used to dislike intensely, and then started to read again recently and now admire enormously. E.M. Forster, in one of his novels, I think it's Howard's End, maybe The Longest Journey, says something like one death does not explain another. One death sets its own terms and is only explicable in its own terms and is no help with another death. And I think that that's true. And so I don't think we can learn from someone else how to die. We can only die in our own character. And I think that that's the best we can hope for, is to remain ourselves. And one of the terrors of modern life is being prolonged in a useless body, with a brain and a temperament that is no longer yours, to have become someone else, to no longer be yourself at the end. And I think that's a terrible fate for any person, and it's just as much a terrible fate for anyone who is a member of their family and who sees that happen. So in some ways, we can't learn to die because we don't know the conditions which are then going to apply to our own death. We might be run over in the street, or we might have 10 years trapped in an incapable body. You see, you'd probably prefer me to be talking about Catalan independence, but I can only follow my interlocutor.